She saved a wounded warrior. The next day, 100 men stood at her door. The storm hit like God's own fury, and that's when Mercy found him dying. Lightning split the desert sky as she stepped onto her cabin porch. The wind howled through the canyon, carrying dust and something else. Something that made her heart stop. Blood. Fresh blood on the wooden steps, dark as midnight against the weathered planks. Thunder crashed overhead as she followed the crimson trail. It led around the cabin's corner, where a man lay crumpled against the stone foundation. His shirt hung in tatters, soaked crimson from 3 bullet wounds. His breathing came shallow and quick, like a dying animal. Mercy dropped to her knees beside him. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, washing pink streams across the dirt. The stranger's eyes fluttered open. Blue as winter sky, filled with pain that went deeper than flesh. He tried to speak, but only blood bubbled from his lips. "Don't talk," she whispered, pressing her hands against the worst wound. "Save your strength." She'd seen death before. Living alone in the New Mexico territory taught hard lessons. But something about this man's face stopped her cold. Handsome in a dangerous way, with scars that spoke of violence and a jaw set against surrender. Even bleeding out, he looked like trouble. The rain turned fierce, drumming against the cabin roof like gunshots. Mercy made her choice. She couldn't leave him to die, no matter who he was or what he'd done. Her conscience wouldn't bear another ghost. "Can you walk?" she asked, slipping her arm under his shoulders. He nodded weakly. Together they stumbled inside as the storm raged. She kicked the door shut and guided him to her kitchen table. Oil lamps flickered in the wind seeping through the walls. Their light danced across his pale face as she cut away his ruined shirt. The bullets had torn through muscle and sinew. One had nicked a rib. Another had lodged deep in his shoulder. The third had passed clean through, leaving a jagged exit wound. Mercy had pulled bullets before, from her father during the war and from ranch hands who'd tangled with rustlers. But her hands trembled as she reached for her medical kit. "What's your name?" she asked, hoping to keep him conscious. "Jake," he whispered. His voice carried the weight of secrets. Jake Morrison. The name meant nothing to her, but the way he said it told everything. Like a man carrying shame. Like someone running from judgment. The smart thing would be to patch him up and send him on his way. But storm winds rattled the windows, and something in his eyes begged for mercy. She heated water on the stove while thunder shook the cabin walls. Steam rose from the basin as she cleaned her hands. Jake watched her every movement, alert despite his wounds. A man used to danger, even when helpless. "This will hurt," she said, gripping the forceps. He bit down on a leather strap she offered. His body went rigid as she probed for the bullet in his shoulder. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. But he never cried out. Never begged her to stop. Whatever he was tough as rawhide. The bullet came free with a wet sucking sound. Jake's head fell back, his breathing ragged. Blood flowed fresh from the wound, but she packed it tight with clean cloth. Her father had taught her well before consumption took him. "Who did this to you?" she asked while stitching the deepest wound. Jake's eyes found hers in the lamplight. Pain and something else flickered there. Regret, maybe. Or fear of what morning would bring. "Men who think justice comes from a rope," he said. Outside, the storm began to calm. Rain still fell, but gentler now. The wind died to whispers through the canyon walls. Mercy finished her work in silence, bandaging each wound with steady hands. When she was done, Jake's chest rose and fell in the rhythm of exhausted sleep. She covered him with her father's old quilt and stood back. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, softening the hard lines around his eyes. He looked younger in sleep, almost innocent. But the gun belt hanging on her chair spoke different truths. Mercy walked to the window and pushed aside the curtain. Dawn was still hours away, but she could feel it coming. With daylight would come questions she wasn't ready to answer. About the stranger in her cabin. About the blood on her hands. About why she'd chosen mercy over wisdom. The rain had washed his tracks from her doorstep, but nothing could wash away what she'd done. In a territory where law came at gunpoint and women lived by reputation alone, she'd just saved the wrong man. She could feel it in her bones, the way her grandmother had always sensed storms before they broke. Jake stirred in his sleep, murmuring words she couldn't catch. His hand reached out, searching for something that wasn't there. Someone who wasn't coming back. Even unconscious, he carried ghosts. Mercy turned from the window and banked the fire. Whatever tomorrow brought, she'd face it. She'd saved a life tonight, and that had to count for something in God's ledger. Even if that life belonged to a man the world wanted dead. The last drops of rain tapped against the glass like fingers of judgment, and somewhere in the distance, coyotes began to howl. Sunday morning brought judgment wrapped in hymns and righteousness. Mercy walked the dusty path to First Baptist, her best dress pressed and her conscience heavy. 3 days had passed since the storm. 3 days since she'd pulled bullets from a stranger's flesh. Jake was healing fast, too fast for a man who should be dead. But secrets have weight, and hers pressed against her chest like a stone. The church bells rang across the valley, calling sinners to salvation. Mercy climbed the wooden steps, nodding to neighbors who'd known her since childhood. Mrs. Henderson smiled from beneath her black bonnet. Old Pete tipped his hat. Everything appeared normal, but the air tasted wrong. Like smoke before fire. She took her usual pew, third from the front on the left side. The morning sun streamed through colored glass, painting rainbow patterns on worn wooden floors. Pastor Williams opened his Bible, but before he could speak, Sheriff Coleman walked through the door. The lawman's boots echoed through sudden silence. His face was granite, his hand resting on his gun. Behind him walked 3 men Mercy had never seen. Hard men with hungry eyes and silver badges. Bounty hunters. Folks, Sheriff Coleman said, his voice carrying to every corner. We're looking for a killer. Jake Morrison. Shot 3 deputy marshals in Silver Creek. There's a $500 bounty on his head. Mercy's blood turned to ice water. The hymn book trembled in her hands. $500 was more money than most folks saw in years. Enough to make neighbors forget friendship. Enough to make good people do evil things. Morrison's wounded, Coleman continued. Someone's been helping him. Hiding him. That makes them an accomplice to murder. The sheriff's eyes swept the congregation like a hawk hunting mice. They lingered on Mercy for a heartbeat too long. Did he know? Had someone seen something? Her mouth went dry as desert sand. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. Sheriff, this is God's house don't shelter killers, Coleman cut him off. Morrison's somewhere close. And when we find who's been hiding him, they'll swing right beside him. Whispers rippled through the pews like wind through wheat. Mercy kept her eyes forward, but she felt the weight of stares. Mrs. Henderson's smile had vanished. Old Pete looked away when she glanced his direction. Fear was spreading, and fear made people cruel. The service began, but nobody listened to Pastor Williams' words about mercy and forgiveness. The bounty hunters took seats in the back, their presence poisoning the air. Every rustle of fabric sounded like gunshots. Every cough echoed like judgment. During the final hymn, Mercy felt someone watching her. She turned slightly and met the eyes of Sarah Coleman, the sheriff's wife. The woman's face twisted with suspicion and something darker. Hatred, maybe. Or jealousy that had been festering for years. After the blessing, Mercy tried to slip out quickly. But Sarah Coleman blocked her path at the door. The sheriff's wife was a hard woman, made harder by years of disappointment. Her husband's failures had curdled her heart like spoiled milk. "Mercy Jenkins," Sarah said loud enough for others to hear. "You look tired, dear. Been losing sleep?" The words carried barbs. Mercy forced a smile. "Just the usual worries, Mrs. Coleman." "Worries?" Sarah's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "I imagine a woman living alone has many worries. Especially when strangers come calling in the night." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. Other churchgoers slowed their departure, sensing drama. Mercy felt their eyes boring into her back. In a small town, reputation was everything. Once lost, it never came back. "I don't know what you mean," Mercy said quietly. "Don't you?" Sarah stepped closer, her voice dropping to a whisper only Mercy could hear. "My husband may be a fool, but I'm not. That storm 3 nights ago washed away tracks, but it didn't wash away the smell of blood. Or the sight of lamplight burning all night in your cabin." Mercy's heart hammered against her ribs. Sarah Coleman had been watching. Waiting. Building her case with the patience of a spider. "You always were too soft," Sarah continued, her smile poisonous. "Your father spoiled you. Made you think you could save everyone. But some people ain't worth saving, child. And helping them just makes you guilty of their sins." Pastor Williams appeared at Mercy's shoulder. "Ladies, perhaps this conversation should wait." "No." Sarah's eyes never left Mercy's face. "Some things can't wait. Some truths need saying in the light of day, in front of God and neighbors." She raised her voice again, making sure everyone could hear. "I know what you did, Mercy Jenkins. And if you don't make it right, I'll make sure everyone else knows too." The threat hit like a physical blow. Mercy looked around at faces she'd known all her life. Friends who'd shared meals at her table. Neighbors who'd helped harvest her garden. But now she saw doubt in their eyes. Suspicion taking root like poison ivy. "Mrs. Henderson whispered something to her daughter. Old Pete shook his head sadly. Even Pastor Williams looked uncertain, his faith in her shaken by Sarah's accusations. Mercy straightened her shoulders and met Sarah's gaze. "I've done nothing I'm ashamed of. Haven't you?" Sarah's smile turned triumphant. "Then you won't mind if my husband searches your cabin. Today. This afternoon." The trap was sprung. Jake was still there, still healing, still weak. A search would find him, and finding him would mean 2 graves instead of 1. Mercy felt the walls of her world closing in, built from judgment and small-town cruelty. "That won't be necessary," she said, but her voice sounded far away. "Oh, but I think it will." Sarah smoothed her skirts with satisfaction. "Justice demands it. And God demands justice, doesn't he, Pastor?" The preacher looked between them, caught between mercy and law. His silence was answer enough. As Mercy walked home through the desert heat, she knew everything had changed. War was coming to her quiet canyon, and she was caught between 2 kinds of justice. The law's justice, swift and final. And her own conscience, which had saved a man's life and might now cost her own. Behind her, church bells rang again, but they sounded like funeral tolls in the gathering storm. Jake was gone when Mercy returned from church. Her cabin stood empty, the quilt folded neat on the kitchen table where she'd left him healing. Only the faint smell of carbolic soap and the blood-stained bandages in her wash basin proved he'd ever been there. Relief and disappointment warred in her chest. He was smart to run. But something cold settled in her stomach at his absence. She found him at sunset, sitting on the ridge behind her cabin. The desert stretched below them like a sea of gold and shadow. Jake's shirt hung loose over fresh bandages, his face pale but determined. His gun belt was strapped tight around his waist again, and that told her everything. "Heard church bells this morning," he said without turning. "Sounded like funeral bells to me." Mercy sat beside him on the rocky outcrop. The evening air carried the scent of sage and something else. Danger, maybe. Or the weight of decisions that couldn't be undone. "They know you're here," she said quietly. "Sarah Coleman's been watching. She's got her husband ready to search my cabin." Jake's jaw tightened. "Then you're smart to let me go." "I didn't let you do anything." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "You made that choice yourself." He turned to look at her then, those winter blue eyes searching her face. "Why'd you save me, Mercy? And don't say it was Christian charity. You knew what I was the moment you saw me." The question hung between them like smoke. Below, coyotes began their evening song, haunting and wild. Mercy pulled her shawl tighter against the desert chill. "Maybe I was tired of being alone," she said. "Maybe I needed to save something instead of watching everything die." Jake was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of confession. "Those deputies I killed. They weren't good men. Doesn't matter now. It does to me." He picked up a stone and threw it into the gathering darkness. "They were stealing from the Apache reservation. Food meant for starving children. Medicine for the sick. Selling it in town and keeping the money." The words hit Mercy like a physical blow. She'd heard stories about corruption on the reservations. Whispered tales of government agents who grew rich while native families starved. But hearing it from Jake's lips made it real. "I tried talking to their captain first," he continued. "Showed him the evidence. Bills of sale, forged papers. He laughed in my face. Said dead Indians were good Indians, and a few less mouths to feed meant more profit for everyone." Mercy studied his profile in the dying light. The hard lines around his eyes spoke of pain that went deeper than bullets. This was a man carrying ghosts. "So you killed them?" "I killed them. No excuses. No justification. Just the flat truth. Shot them down in the street like the dogs they were. And I'd do it again." The honesty in his voice scared her more than any lie could have. This wasn't a man who killed for pleasure or profit. This was someone who'd chosen justice when law failed. Someone who'd damned himself to save others. "There were Apache children dying," Jake said, his voice barely a whisper. "Babies too weak to cry. I watched a mother try to feed her son bark soup because they'd stolen the grain meant for his belly. What was I supposed to do? Write letters? Wait for justice that would never come?" Mercy closed her eyes. She could picture it too clearly. The stolen food. The dying children. The choice between right and legal that wasn't really a choice at all. "How many people know the truth?" she asked. "None that matter." Jake's laugh was bitter. "Dead deputies become heroes. Living outlaws become legends. Truth gets buried with the men who spoke it." The first stars appeared overhead, cold and distant. Mercy had lived her whole life following rules, trusting that good behavior brought good rewards. But sitting beside this man who'd chosen damnation over complicity, her certainties crumbled like desert clay. "Why tell me?" she asked. Jake turned to face her fully. In the starlight, his face looked younger, more vulnerable. "Because you deserve to know what you're risking your life for. Because when they come for me tomorrow, you'll have to choose. And you should choose with all the truth." "What if I already chose?" The words surprised them both. Mercy hadn't planned to say them, but once spoken, she knew they were true. Somewhere between pulling bullets from his flesh and watching him throw stones at the darkness, she'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. Jake's hand found hers in the darkness. His fingers were warm despite the desert cold, calloused from years of hard living. "They'll call you an outlaw's whore. Spit in your face. Burn your cabin and salt your land so nothing ever grows again. Let them." "Mercy. Her name on his lips sounded like a prayer. You don't know what you're saying. Don't I? She turned their joined hands over, studying the scars that mapped his knuckles. I've spent my whole life being what others expected. The good daughter. The proper woman. The lonely spinster who bothers nobody and saves nobody and matters to nobody. Jake's thumb traced across her palm. You matter to me. The words hung between them like a bridge across an impossible canyon. Below them, the desert wind stirred the sage, carrying the scent of rain that might never come. Above them, the stars watched with ancient indifference. I killed those men, Jake said again, as if testing the weight of truth between them. I know. I'll probably die tomorrow. Maybe we both will. He leaned closer then, and she could smell the soap she'd used to clean his wounds, mixed with leather and gunpowder and something essentially him. Are you afraid? Mercy considered the question seriously. Fear lived in her chest like a second heartbeat, but it was overwhelmed by something stronger. Purpose, maybe. Or the terrible freedom that came with choosing love over safety. Terrified, she whispered. But not of dying. Of living with regret. Jake's lips found hers in the darkness. The kiss tasted of desert wind and desperate hope, of choices that couldn't be undone and futures that might never come. When they broke apart, the world had changed around them. Not the landscape or the stars, but something deeper. The invisible lines that separated right from wrong, legal from just, salvation from damnation. Tomorrow would bring Sheriff Coleman and his bounty hunters. Tomorrow would bring judgment and probably death. But tonight belonged to them, outlaw and accomplice, sharing secrets under a canopy of stars that had watched countless other lovers face impossible odds. In the distance, a train whistle echoed through the canyon, lonely and haunting. The sound of civilization approaching, bringing law and order and the end of everything wild and free. They came with the sunrise, an army of men hungry for blood money. Mercy woke to the thunder of hoofbeats echoing through the canyon. 50 riders, maybe more, spreading across the valley like a plague of locusts. Sheriff Coleman led them, his badge glinting in the morning sun. Behind him rode the bounty hunters from church, their faces hard with greed. And behind them, a mob of townsmen who traded mercy for silver. $500 could buy a lot of forgiveness. Jake stood at her cabin window, his gun already in his hand. The morning light caught the worry lines around his eyes. He'd known this moment would come, but knowing and facing were different creatures entirely. How many? Mercy asked, wrapping her father's old robe tight around her shoulders. Too many. Jake's voice was steady, but she heard the fear underneath. Coleman brought half the territory. Word must have spread about the bounty. Through the glass, they watched the riders fan out across the canyon floor. Some headed for the ridge trails. Others positioned themselves near the creek. They were sealing every escape route, building a net of flesh and steel around her tiny cabin. There's still time, Mercy whispered. The back trail through Devil's Canyon. You could, no. Jake turned from the window, his face set like stone. I'm done running. Done bringing death to innocent people. I'm not innocent anymore. The words hung between them like gun smoke. Jake crossed to where she stood, his boots loud on the wooden floor. Outside, the riders drew closer, their voices carrying on the desert wind. Harsh laughter. Cruel speculation about the reward money. The sound of justice perverted by greed. You could still walk away, Jake said, touching her cheek. Tell them you never saw me. That I threatened you. Forced you to help. Mercy caught his hand and pressed it against her face. His skin was warm, real, alive. In an hour, he might be cold meat hanging from a rope. The thought made her stomach clench like a fist. I could, she agreed. But I won't. Jake's eyes searched her face for doubt, for the fear that would let him leave her with a clear conscience. He found neither. Instead, he found something that scared him more than bullets. Love that would follow him into hell. A shout rang out across the canyon. Sheriff Coleman's voice, magnified by the rock walls. "Jake Morrison. We know you're in there. Come out peaceable and the woman don't get hurt." Mercy moved to the window and pushed aside the curtain. Coleman sat his horse 50 yards away, just outside rifle range. Smart man. Behind him, the bounty hunters fingered their weapons like lovers. Their horses stamped and snorted, sensing the violence to come. "What about it, Morrison?" Coleman called again. "You gonna hide behind a woman's skirts? Let her pay for your sins." Jake's jaw worked like he was chewing leather. The sheriff knew exactly which buttons to push. Honor and shame, twisted together until they became the same thing. In the West, a man's reputation was worth more than his life. And Coleman was betting Jake's pride would drag him into the open. "Don't listen," Mercy said. "It's a trap. I know what it is." Jake checked the cylinder of his revolver. 6 bullets against 50 men. The odds of a man already dead. But he's right about one thing. "You shouldn't pay for my choices." "Our choices," she corrected. "I chose this too." Outside, the riders grew restless. Some dismounted and took positions behind rocks. Others stayed mounted, ready to run down anyone who tried to flee. The morning sun climbed higher, turning the desert air thick and still. Perfect weather for killing. Mercy moved to her father's old trunk and pulled out his Navy Colt. The gun felt heavy in her hands, weighted with memories of the war that had taken him away piece by piece. She'd sworn never to touch it again, but oaths meant nothing when love was at stake. "Can you shoot?" Jake asked, watching her check the loads. "Daddy taught me before he went to fight the Yankees. Said a woman alone needed to know how to protect herself." Her fingers trembled slightly on the grip. "Never thought I'd use it to protect someone else." Jake moved to his rifle, propped against the wall where he'd left it. A Winchester with a worn stock and sights that had drawn blood. He worked the lever, feeding a cartridge into the chamber. The mechanical sound was loud in the cabin's stillness. "Morrison." Coleman's patience was wearing thin. "You got 1 minute to show yourself. After that, we come in shooting." Through the window, Mercy watched Sarah Coleman sitting side-saddle behind the sheriff. The woman's face glowed with triumph, like she was watching Christmas morning unfold. This was her victory. Her moment of vindication against a town that had never given her the respect she craved. 30 seconds, Morrison. Jake kissed Mercy one last time, soft and desperate. His lips tasted of coffee and regret, of words they'd never have time to say. When they broke apart, both their faces were wet with tears they hadn't realized they'd shed. "If we don't make it," Jake began. "We will," Mercy interrupted. She didn't believe it, but saying it made her feel stronger. "We have to." Jake positioned himself at the front window. Mercy took the back, where the kitchen faced the creek trail. If Coleman was smart, he'd send men around both sides. Catch them in crossfire. End it quick and clean. "Time's up, Morrison." The silence stretched like a held breath. Then Coleman raised his hand, and the world exploded into violence. Rifles cracked from 3 directions at once. Bullets shattered the windows and chewed chunks from the cabin walls. Mercy pressed herself against the floor as glass rained down like deadly snow. Jake returned fire, his Winchester barking defiance. She heard a scream from outside, then cursing. First blood to them, but it wouldn't be the last. Not by a long shot. The siege of Mercy's cabin had begun, and only God knew how it would end. The gunfight lasted 3 hours, but it felt like a lifetime wrapped in smoke and thunder. Jake's rifle sang its deadly song from the front window while Mercy held the back. Bullets chewed through the cabin walls like hungry termites, splintering wood and shattering dishes. The smell of gunpowder mixed with dust and fear, creating a fog that burned their lungs with every breath. 2 bounty hunters lay still in the dirt outside. Jake's marksmanship had thinned their numbers, but barely. For every man that fell, 2 more seemed to take his place. The canyon echoed with Coleman's shouted orders and the crack of rifles that never seemed to run empty. "We're running low," Jake called over the gunfire. His face was streaked with sweat and powder burns. Blood seeped through his shirt where a bullet had reopened one of his wounds. Mercy counted her remaining cartridges. 8 bullets left. Maybe 9 if she'd miscounted. Not nearly enough for the army gathering outside. Through the shattered back window, she watched more riders pour into the canyon. Word had spread throughout the territory. Every gun hand and treasure hunter for 100 miles was converging on her cabin like buzzards to carrion. "Jake Morrison." Coleman's voice boomed across the battlefield. "You're outnumbered 20 to 1. Surrender now and I'll make sure the woman gets a fair trial." Jake's laugh was bitter as desert alkali. Fair trial. Right before they fit her for a rope. Another volley of bullets hammered the cabin. One punched through the kitchen wall and embedded itself in the opposite timber, inches from Mercy's head. She pressed herself lower, tasting dust and desperation. The sun climbed higher, turning the cabin into an oven. Sweat stung her eyes as she peered through the window at the men positioning themselves behind rocks and scrub brush. They had all the time in the world. All the ammunition. All the advantages except one. They were fighting for money. She and Jake were fighting for love. There. Jake's rifle cracked again. Got the bastard behind the big boulder. But even as one fell, 3 more took covered positions. The net was tightening. Soon they'd rush the cabin from all sides, and no amount of love could stop that many bullets. "Mercy." Jake's voice was soft despite the chaos. "I need you to know something." She looked at him across the smoke-filled room. His face was pale from blood loss, but his eyes burned bright as stars. Beautiful and doomed and absolutely certain. "I love you," he said. "Whatever happens next, I love you more than life itself." The words hit harder than any bullet. Mercy felt them lodge in her chest, warm and permanent. "I love you too." A new sound cut through the gunfire. Hoofbeats, but different. Rhythmic. Organized. Military. Jake peered through his window and his face went white as bleached bone. "What is it?" Mercy asked. "Cavalry." His voice was hollow. "A full company, maybe more." Through the settling dust, blue uniforms appeared on the canyon rim. Soldiers on horseback, their guidons snapping in the desert wind. At their head rode a captain with silver hair and eyes like winter frost. Behind him came 2 wagons loaded with supplies and a small cannon that glinted in the sunlight. Captain Marcus Webb had arrived with the United States Army, and everything changed in that moment. Coleman spurred his horse forward to meet the soldiers. Even from a distance, Mercy could see his confusion. This wasn't part of his plan. The army wasn't supposed to interfere with civilian law enforcement. But Captain Webb dismounted and walked straight to the sheriff, his face carved from granite. Their conversation carried on the wind, fragments of words that made Jake straighten like he'd been struck by lightning. "Investigation, corruption, federal charges, stand down immediately." "No," Jake whispered. "It can't be." But it was. Captain Webb was reading from official documents, his voice carrying the authority of the United States government. The stolen food. The dead Apache children. The evidence Jake had tried to show the corrupt deputies. Someone had been listening after all. Coleman's face went from confusion to rage to fear in the space of heartbeats. His bounty hunters looked to him for orders, but he had none to give. Federal authority trumped local law, especially when that local law was about to be arrested for conspiracy and murder. Jake Morrison. Captain Webb's voice boomed across the canyon. By order of the Secretary of War, you are hereby granted full pardon for actions taken in defense of federal property and Native American lives. Surrender your weapons and submit to federal protection. The words echoed off the canyon walls like thunder from heaven. Mercy felt her knees go weak with relief so sudden it was painful. Jake stared through the window as if seeing a miracle, which maybe he was. But Coleman wasn't finished. His face twisted with rage at seeing his prize slip away. $500 and the respect that came with bringing down Jake Morrison, vanishing like smoke. He drew his pistol and spurred his horse toward the cabin, screaming like a man possessed. Jake's rifle spoke once more. The bullet took Coleman's center mass, spinning him from his saddle. He hit the ground hard and didn't move again. The bounty hunters scattered like quail, suddenly very interested in being somewhere else when the army started asking questions. Sarah Coleman's scream cut through the sudden quiet. She threw herself from her horse and ran to her husband's body, keening like a lost soul. Her grief was real, even if her husband had been corrupt. Love didn't always choose good men, Mercy knew. Sometimes it chose broken ones who needed saving. Captain Webb approached the cabin alone, his hands visible and empty. Jake emerged first, his rifle lowered but ready. Then Mercy stepped out into the sunlight, blinking after hours in the smoke-filled cabin. Mr. Morrison, the captain said formally. Miss Jenkins. You're both under federal protection now. The corruption investigation will require your testimony, but you're free to go wherever you choose after that. Free. The word tasted strange on Mercy's tongue. She'd expected to die today, and instead found herself standing in bright sunlight with the man she loved, surrounded by blue uniforms that meant safety instead of danger. Jake took her hand, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. Relief, or shock, or maybe just the aftermath of violence. Where will we go? She asked. He looked out across the desert that had nearly been their grave, then back at her face. Somewhere green, he said. Somewhere it rains without storms. Somewhere we can start over clean. Captain Webb supervised the removal of Coleman's body while his soldiers rounded up the few bounty hunters too slow or too greedy to run. The siege was over, justice had arrived wearing blue uniforms, and love had somehow survived the day. As the sun began its descent toward the western mountains, Jake and Mercy stood together on the ridge where they'd shared confessions and kisses under starlight. Below them, the army made camp for the night. Tomorrow would bring testimonies and trials, justice finally served to men who'd grown fat on others' suffering. But tonight belonged to them, two souls who'd chosen love over safety and found redemption in each other's arms.